What does ancient Sumer, the New Kingdom of Egypt, the Persian Achaemenid Empire, the Attica Empire, the Spartan Empire, the Carthaginian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Mongol Empire, the Umayyad Empire, the Timurid Empire, Mansa Musa's Kingdom of Mali, the Ottoman Empire, and the Empire of Japan all have in common with Western Europe? Slavery. They all have slavery in common. Slavery, since its inception within ancient Sumer, has been the lifeblood of Old World and New World imperialism. Contrary to the Reed settlers crowd, slavery has not been the sole monopoly of Western European interests, who neither invented or perfected the immoral practice. However, that is not to say that the practice of slavery, as far as the Americas are concerned, hasn't been the monopoly of Western Europeans, for such certainly has been. Initially, the prime motivation behind Western European colonization of the Americas was tied to three prime factors. One, circumventing the Silk Road, hotly contested between the Golden Horde, that is the fragmented Mongol Empire, the Timurid Empire, the Ottomans, the Ming Dynasty, and various Islamic caliphates, either all directly or indirectly engaged in the slave trade, mind you, as a way and means to reach China and India. This did not happen as Columbus happened upon land masses that were previously not really known to Eurasian cartographers at the time. This objective was a failure. No direct western passage from Western Europe to China was established. The European Christian monarchies would never fully control the Silk Road, and to this day they're still pissed off about that. Number two, spreading Christianity to China and India as a means to justify the existence of Christian states to A, halt the spread of Islam's sphere of influence and thus lock them out of the East Asian market, B, devise a scheme to control all of the ports of the Silk Road, Beijing, Shanghai, Mumbai, Cairo, and Istanbul, which back then was known as Constantinople. C, resource monopolization and capital accumulation in the form of tithes and taxes to the church, which would pay tribute to the monarch states sponsoring them. Upon the discovery of gold, silver, and mineral deposits in the Americas, with no Islam or Mongols competing for influence, Western Europe would ditch the plan to monopolize the Silk Road and instead spread their violent gospel, territorial and religious disputes included, to the Americas and implement slavery as a means to extract resources and cultivate foodstuffs and crops. The Protestant British would win the five-way race, or six-way race, between themselves, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Portugal, and the Danish, with Catholic Spain and France coming in second place. In last place, certainly, would come the indigenous, mainly decimated by biological pathogens forwarded to the Americas, indirectly, and directly via the means of crusader state mentality, being subjugated in the name of the monarch who was chosen by the divine right of God to lord over all and stop the spread of heresy. The indigenous to the Americas, while developing the semi-advanced centralized states in Tenochtitlan and Cusco, were not akin to the non-European power centers established in Samarkand, Baghdad, Damascus, or Beijing, and were not exposed to 2 millennia worth of trade wars disguised as holy wars, and were not expecting gunpowder, which was applied in Old World combat for 200 years prior to the late 15th century. It was not a fair fight. And while the Reed settlers crowd has a right to be angry, they should not be so naive to believe that if the Christian reconquista of Spain had failed and the Americas were out under the spear of Islam, that the morbid trajectory of indigenous Americans would have been any different. 100 years prior to Columbus, Tamerlane, known as the Sword of Islam, responsible for upwards to 17 to 20 million deaths, had his army of 200,000 enslaved 100,000 Hindus before his attack on Delhi, which is in India, of course. Fearing a revolt, Tamerlane had all 100,000 subjugated Hindus beheaded, then proceeded onto Delhi, wiping out 99%, 80,000 inhabitants. 99% of the 80,000 inhabitants within Delhi, ransacking it of all of its spices, diamonds, and gold, and then burning the whole entire city of Delhi to the ground. If Tamerlane was in Columbus's shoes, would he have had acted any differently? For 2,000 years, what we look back on as reprehensible atrocities, slavery, genocide, and conquest in the name of God, has been standard operational procedure for all European and non-European empires of the Old World, and it just happened that Western Europe brought the Old World to the New World. Number 3. Developing markets in the name of religious freedom. The settlements of Massachusetts and Virginia were bankrolled by private investors who felt for the plight of religious zealots persecuted for not acknowledging the supremacy of the British monarch as the head of the Church of England. Think of it as a counter-Protestant Reformation, thus giving premise for the Puritans and the Pilgrims to exist. Certainly no one on the Mayflower was thinking, we are going to take all of North America and start our own country in the name of pan-European manifest destiny. This racist philosophy didn't really start coming around until, I'll say, the late 18th century, early 19th century, and scientific racism promulgated by the perverted minds of Madison Grant and Woodrow Wilson, which influenced Hitler, wouldn't be concocted until the late 19th century. The intent of the first settlers was probably to be religiously devout farmers living off the land and worshiping God without paying tithes to the Church of England. Unfortunately, those pesky proto-capitalist interests bankrolling them didn't see it that way. They had every intent of using British settlers as their foot in the door to develop mercantile companies in the name of developing a trade network to compete with other Western European nations engaged in the same practices, mind you, while the Crown had their designs still set on India. However, as populations were sparse, slaves were imported from sub-Saharan Africa as a means to extract resources and develop agriculture in the name of extracting profits. However, by no means was this horrific concept without prior precedent, as the Umayyad Caliphate, upon the conquest of northern Africa, was facilitating a slave trade to develop their spheres of influence going back to the 8th century. Western Europeans appropriated this concept with the same intent and also probably to sap human labor from the Ottoman Empire on the down low, and thus establishing the premise for the transatlantic slave trade. These three prime factors would build the foundation of what would later become the United States, which was most certainly indeed built on the slave trade after the colonies declared independence from the Crown. And after not wanting to pay, the British Crown for its transatlantic territorial disputes with France and Spain, having recently put India under their sphere of influence, it proved too expensive for the Crown to retain direct control, keyword, direct control, over the North American colonies, and after 8 years of protracted warfare within the colonies, and the United States of America was established with all the spoils of North America to be exploited by colonial bourgeois interests and their offspring, who, yes, were Western European Caucasians. Now that we have established context, according to pseudo-intellectual libertarian Styxhexxenhammer, slavery did not build the wealth of the United States, despite, as we have established, 2,000 years worth of slavery building the wealth of every other European and non-European empire that has ever existed. Who exactly is Styx fooling here when he says slavery did not build the wealth of the United States, when the $3 billion transatlantic slave trade is what literally enabled the United States to exist in the first place? For Christ's sakes, the United States Capitol building and the Executive Mansion were literally built by slave labor. Styx then goes to make this argument that the North didn't really have slavery. Yes, the North did. The North did have slavery. It wasn't agrarian slavery, but more so in the form of domestic household servitude and pre-skyscraper urban construction, i.e. Washington, D.C. Yes, the North did have slavery, and what more, while owning slaves in New York was illegal in the 1820s, Wall Street facilitated the slave trade as a way to raise capital to pay London banking interests, who were loaning capital for infrastructure development like the Erie Canal, freshwater aqueducts, and early northeastern railroads. Then Styx mockingly says, skyscrapers are not made out of cotton. Well, no shit they aren't made out of cotton. But more often than not, the stone quarried from those skyscrapers came from prison labor. And in fact, one of the first organized labor riots, something I know Styx is not fond of, organized labor, that happened in the United States. It happened in 1833 in the proximity of Washington Square Park within Greenwich Village over NYU's construction materials being provided by prison labor being performed at Sing Sing Prison. Then later on, Andrew Carnegie's U.S. Steel kept wages low to maximize profits while laborers toiled producing the steel that would be used on taller skyscrapers. But low wages aren't as evil as slavery. Stupid idiots. However, the kicker here is that Styx openly admits that plantation agriculture held back the South from economic development. Why is this the kicker? Because the whole libertarian philosophy which Styx claims to adhere to is based on the Jeffersonian philosophy, literally tied to plantation agriculture as a means to foster economic development. Thomas Jefferson envisioned a country of slave-owning agrarian farmers ruling and controlling their own destinies absent of paying taxes to a strong central government and being beholden to the subjugation of banks and industry. Styx literally dissed the core of what his stupid libertarian philosophy is based on, and indirectly made the argument that Alexander Hamilton, who libertarians hate, was right this whole time. So Styx, on this presumption, is either the one-eyed man leading the kingdom of the blind, or he's making an indirect argument as to say that slavery isn't that bad. Finally, Styx invokes modern-day slavery in Libya. Well, prior to Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, Libya had the highest life expectancy and highest rate of literacy in northern Africa. But because they didn't like Gaddafi locking the West out of their oil market, they had to go. Oh, let's create a bunch of instability and invite Al-Qaeda in. And oh, now look, slavery is a thing in Libya when it wasn't before, thanks to the United States. Well, look at all those other undeveloped African countries. Yeah, look at them, toiling away in diamond mines and cobalt mines to make Western corporate interests based in the United States rich. But slavery didn't build wealth in the USA. Then he goes to bring up China. And I agree, China has a human trafficking problem. And where is that primary source of human trafficking coming from? Why, that would be the autonomous region of Hong Kong, whose strict independence is one that Styx supports and which China is trying to clamp down on. Is Styx making an argument here that Hong Kong is better off free from China so they can continue facilitating human trafficking? I thought slavery was bad. In closing, Styxhexxenhammer is full of shit, shilling for the perpetuation of the oppressive economic system that is neoliberalism, which implements slave labor to keep corporations based in the U.S. and in the U.K. wealthy. And the Reed Settlers crowd needs to read all 6 volumes of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire to fully understand the scope of human history beyond J. Sakai's narrow worldview that every evil in the world can be tied exclusively to Europe when the historical record indicates otherwise. Slavery did build wealth in the United States, but through collective labor where we own a stake in the means and modes of our production, we can build our wealth in the future in a far more ethical manner. And the capitalists like Styxhexenhammer don't want that. But they will have no choice but to capitulate sooner or later. Because if they don't, China will take over. Oh well. Like and share, especially on Facebook since I'm banned for a few more weeks, if you feel obligated to. This is Comrade Pella, signing off.